salvation be exalted. The Lord is blessed, and blessed be my rock. Let the Lord of my salvation be exalted. Lady of Fatima, Immaculate Mother of Grace, oh pray for us, help us today. The hope of the human race.
The 12th, 11th and 12th of October 1917, there was a raging storm. Rain all over the country, into Spain, even parts of France. It was a storm right across continental Europe. Yet that did not prevent the people from coming, and they came in their thousands. It's estimated that the crowd at Fatima was something like 70,000 people. Half the population of St. Lucia, and a bit. They came mostly on foot. Some came in carriages, some they afforded it in cars. But they didn't get very far because the ground was waterlogged and the carriage was sinking. In addition to this, the media, the newspapers of the day, were delighted because they were certain there would be no miracle, that the trickery of the church would be revealed. It was the end of religion, and the church and the priests, the bishops, would be discredited forever. And so there would be an atheistic country at last. And the newspapers, O Secolo in particular, had a front page cover denouncing the deception practiced by the church, insisting there was no miracle, absolutely certain. And so the reporters were there, government officials were there, believers and unbelievers alike were present. The children, Lucia's mother was terrified because she knew there was going to be no miracle, and she thought that her daughter would be killed. She would be killed as an associate to this deception. She thought this was the end of her family, everything was over. She begged Lucia, she said, "Tell them you lied, and perhaps we can escape." And Lucia said, "But Mama, I didn't lie, we saw the lady." So, at the very last moment, the children were carried by Timato, Francesco's and Jacinta's father. They were brought to the crowd, through the crowd. There are pictures of people under umbrellas. They're in mud, well above the ankles. And 12 noon. Lucia says, "Close your umbrellas, the lady is coming." And as if a megaphone, the whole crowd seemed to have heard, and they closed their umbrellas. And the rain is pouring down. And then at 12 noon, the rain stops, and the light, the globe descends over the Hormuz. And Lucia speaks and says, "What do you want from us?" And the lady responded, "I want to tell you that I want a chapel to be erected here in my honor, for I am the Lady of the Rosary. Continue praying the Rosary every day. The war will soon end. The soldiers will return to their homes. Amend your life and do not offend God anymore." And then she opened her hands and she cast the light up towards the sun. And Lucia then said, look at the sun. And their photographs, you can Google it, it's on the internet, that as the crowds looked up, the clouds opened, and they could see the sun as a dull disk shining in the sky. And then it started to pulse, and all the colors of the rainbow, one after the other, reflected onto the crowds there. Yellow, green, blue, orange, and so on. The colors of the rainbow. And then they saw the sun begin to spin. And suddenly it dislodged itself from the sky. And like a huge fireball was heading towards the earth. And as you can imagine, there was mass public confession. People threw themselves on their feet, confessing their sins, begging for mercy. And in the same instant, as it seemed almost to reach the earth, it went back and settled in the heavens, shining as it always did, as if nothing had happened. And when the people caught themselves, they found that their clothes was bone dry. The ground itself was hard, as if there had been no rain. I say that because one of the explanations given for it is mass hallucination. But you cannot have as a hallucination waterlogged soil being bone dry in a few seconds. That's not mass hallucination. That is a scientific fact. And this was reported by the same newspapers, at least they had that decency. They reported the same newspapers who the day before had said, there will be no miracle, this is the end of religion, etc. The same ones reported what they had seen. And so you can have au século, you have the two copies, the two editions side by side, one mocking and the other one confirming. The children, however, did not see the dance of the sun as it is called. They saw something very different. They saw three tableaus, three pictures. The first was that of St. Joseph, the child Jesus, and Our Lady in white with a mantle, perhaps something like the Our Lady of Lourdes or the Immaculate Conception. And St. Joseph and the child Jesus blessed the crowd. The second was Our Lord as a grown man, crowned with thorns, and Our Lady of Sorrows. And the third was Our Lady of Mount Carmel. Immediately we had that, we know exactly what we're talking about. The joyful, the Holy Family. The sorrowful, Our Lady of Sorrows and Our Lord crowned with thorns. And Our Lady of Mount Carmel, the glorious mysteries. So again, there's this insistence on the importance of the Rosary. And so, people are now convinced they had seen the miracle, which, remember, was not as great as originally planned. Because Arturo Santos had kidnapped the children. It tells us something very important. One sin can lead to the condemnation of many people. So 1917 ends, and 1918, the war ends. But in the autumn of 1918, influenza broke out, and both Francesco and Jacinta fell ill. Francesco suffered greatly. He was in constant pain, but he made his first communion on the 3rd of April 1919 and died the next day. Jacinta developed bronchial pneumonia with a very painful chest abscess. She was first of all sent to OREM for treatment, but her condition only worsened and she ended up with an open wound She was then sent to Lisbon in January of 1920, where she was diagnosed with purulent pleurisy and diseased ribs. Surgery was carried out, and 2 of the ribs were removed, and she ended up with a large wound in her side. She was in constant pain, and it would seem Our Lady appeared to her on 2 occasions, and she was able, in fact, to say that her death was imminent. The nun who looked after her was amazed at the strength of character in the child, who embraced suffering so willingly and so readily. And so she made her first confession. She begged for Holy Communion, but the priest didn't think that she was so close to death. So she made her first confession 20th February and died that same night. Lucia was sent 4 years later, in 1921, to Porto, to a school run by the Sisters of St. Dorothy, with orders she was to say nothing about Fatima or the apparitions. And it's from there she would learn to read and write, and she would join the sisters. In March of 1922, a chapel which had been built, as Our Lady requested, was destroyed by a bomb, and there were threats of violence against the pilgrims who went there. The church remained quiet. The bishop issued a pastoral letter in 1922 saying that despite Lucia's absence, government opposition, and the church's own silence, people still came to Fatima, and so he set up a commission to look into the apparitions. In 1927, the first official ceremony was held at the Cova, and pilgrimages became official, and in 1930, the bishop officially approved Fatima as worthy of belief. In 1920, so that completes the apparitions, but there are going to be another series of apparitions following on to what has already happened at Fatima. On June the 13th, 1929, so this is 12 years after the apparitions at the Cova, Our Lady appeared to Sister Lucy. She's now joined the Dorotheans in Tyre in Spain, and in a great and sublime vision, she showed Lucia a tableau of the Blessed Trinity, in which she saw this huge cross and a man up to his chest on the cross. Above him is another man who is holding the cross, and on his chest he has a dove. So this represents, of course, the Blessed Trinity, as we know, for instance, in fact, today's feast, the baptism, where Christ is baptized in the flesh, the voice of the Father is heard, the dove, the Holy Spirit, in the form of a dove appears. Or at the Mount of Transfiguration, Christ is seen, the Father appears, and there's a cloud. So it's a representation of the Blessed Trinity. But at the arms of the cross, on one side, on the right-hand side, Our Lady is standing as Our Lady of Fatima, and on the other side, there is blood dripping, and the words grace and mercy. And having shown her this, Our Lady then says, the moment has come for God to ask the Holy Father, the Pope, to make, in union with all the bishops of the world, the consecration of Russia to my Immaculate Heart. By this means, he promises to save Russia. So the request was made in 1929, and specifically, she said, the time has come. Of course, the natural question to ask is, what happened in 1929 that caused the time to come? Well, what happened was Well, many things happened, but in particular, Stalin had begun the persecution of the Catholic Church and the Russian Orthodox Church in 1929. The Bolsheviks were already persecuting the church, but Stalin now was determined to extinguish the church. And he began in earnest. The first thing among the things that he did was he planted KGB agents in the Russian Orthodox Church. And by 1941, so that's another 12 years, the hierarchy of the Russian Orthodox Church consisted of 130 bishops, was reduced to 28. 20%, 80% of them had been killed. And from 50,000 priests, there were only 500 left. 99% of them had been killed. And 90% of the churches had been destroyed. So Lucy passed the message on. She spoke to her confessor, and in turn the bishop was informed. What happened? Nothing. Can you really trust visionaries? That's the question that's been asked, I suppose. And so 2 years later, August 19th, notice the dates. Our Lady had appeared on August 19th in 1917 because the children had been kidnapped. She now appears again and says, since the church's pastors choose to delay, our Lord himself, speaking to Sister Lucy, expressed his displeasure, saying, make it known to my ministers that, given they follow the example of the King of France in delaying the execution of my command, they will also follow him into misfortune. Because the Pope and bishops refused to do the consecration, they will now follow the King of France into misfortune. We're talking about the French Revolution. He also went on to say, in fact, this goes back now to the July apparition, where Our Lady spoke about the night with unknown light. On the 7 years later, on the night of the 25th to 26th of January 1938, a mysterious light covered the sky in the evening and extended over a large part of the northern hemisphere. It was called an unusual northern lights, or Aurora Borealis. But it could not be, for two reasons. First, the northern lights are caused by sunspots, and at that time there was a minimal amount of sunspot activity recorded. Secondly, the mysterious illumination of the sky, bright red, with no streaks or movement whatsoever, was entirely different from the normal occurrences. It was just the whole sky was bright red, and some people actually thought the cities were on fire. The newspapers recorded fire engines racing around looking for the fires. And this was seen right across the northern hemisphere, from Alaska all the way to Russia, and as far as the North Pole, all the way to the northern part of Italy. When the American newspapers can talk about it, and they knew nothing about Fatima, it tells us something supernatural is occurring. There is no scientific explanation up to today. But Sister Lucy knew what was going on, and she said it was the predicted sign, the Lord, that he is about to chastise the world with another war. The predictions Sister Lucy made are part of what she'd passed on from what Our Lady had told her in connection with the apparitions at Fatima. And of course, the war broke out later that year when Hitler entered the Sudetenland. This reddish light was impressive in London, in France, Switzerland. The fire engines, as I said, were called out to chase non-existent fires. The New York Times carried an account the next day, January the 26th, about the strange unknown light that stretched from Alaska to Europe. 1941, so the war is now on, the Second World War. In fact, on that night, the 25th to 26th, a Russian spy was being interrogated. He was a supporter of Trotsky and therefore opposed to Stalin. And he managed to convince Stalin to make a pact with Hitler. Well, the pact was made, a non-aggression, but Hitler had other ideas, and he invaded Russia, taking Stalin by surprise, and winning. Up until this moment, the Germans had won everything. It was just full steam ahead, and he expected to end the war of Russia in a couple of months. But it didn't work out like that for a number of reasons. Stalin had infiltrated the Russian Orthodox Church, and he had removed Tikhon, who was the patriarch, and replaced him with his own man, a man called Sergei Stragogotsky, who was, as I said, a KGB agent. And Sergio called on all Russians to support the motherland. He said, forget whether the state is for us or against us, support the motherland. And of course that rallying was because the people were deeply religious, regardless of what the government did to them. And they gathered to defend the motherland. And they were able to hold the Germans at bay. Then Pope Pius XII consecrated the world in October. And the following year, in February, the Germans lost the Battle of Stalingrad. And that was the beginning of the end of the Nazis. Stalin then recognized the patriotic value of religion. And so he would now decide to use religion as a means to increase his own power and to control the people. And so Sergio was elected patriarch in place of Tikhon, who had died. To make a big show of it, he had the consecration of Sergio as a big deal. And who was invited? But the Anglican Archbishop of York, Dr. Cyril Garbett, who arrived in Moscow and was so impressed that when he came back, he said that the communists are not at all against religion. Pope Pius XII wrote the exact opposite. And so who would listen to but Dr. Garbett? And so the story begins to get even more intense. Sergio died just 8 months after his enthronement, but with Stalin's approval, he was succeeded by Alexius I, a KGB agent, and he was the one who brought the Russian Orthodox Church into the World Council of Churches. And I think most of us are old enough to know that the World Council of Churches became the greatest promoter of communism in the developing world, whether in South America or whether in Africa or in Asia. Suddenly Christianity had been infiltrated with a communist ethos, which at heart is atheistic. And I think even now we're seeing the effects of it, because God matters less and less. And what is center stage now is man. So that's basically the background to Fatima. What I want to do next time is to go and look at the details of each month, the apparition each month, and to explain to the best I can, how we should approach Fatima and understand it. So, having said that, I thank you.